The Security Council had met 2 days ago and discussed the situation. We had called for urgent de-escalation of tensions and emphasized on sustained and focused diplomacy to address all issues concerning the situation. However, we note with regret that the calls of the international community to give time to the recent initiatives undertaken by parties to diffuse tensions were not heeded too. The situation is in danger of spiraling into a major crisis. We express our deep concern over the developments, which, if not handled carefully, may well undermine the peace and security of the region. We call for immediate de escalation and for refraining from any further action that could contribute to a worsening of the situation. We call on all parties to exert greater efforts to bridge divergent interests. I would like to underline that the legitimate security interests of all parties should be fully taken into account. India has consistently advocated at the United Nations the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and with agreements entered into by parties concerned. I underline once again that more than 20,000 Indian nationals, including students, are located in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. We are facilitating the return of all Indian nationals, including students, as may be required. We believe that the solution lies in sustained diplomatic dialogue between the concerned parties. In the meantime, we strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint. I thank you.
Я благодарю
I thank the
представителя Индии за его
representative of
заявление.
India for his
Предоставляю
statement,
слово
and I now give the
представителю
floor
Объединенных
to
Арабских
the
Эмиратов.
representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، أود بداية أن أشكر الأمين العام ووكيلة الأمين العام على مداخلاتهما. اجتماعنا هذا هو الاجتماع الرابع الذي يعقده مجلس الأمن حول أوكرانيا في أقل من شهر، وفي ظل التوترات الأخيرة والمثيرة للقلق، أخذت بلادي موقفاً يتمثل في الدعوة إلى خفض التصعيد والعمل على إيجاد حل سلمي للأزمة. وفي هذا الإطار نود أن نشير للجوانب التالية. أولاً، نؤكد على ضرورة اللجوء للحوار وبحسن نية مع تكثيف الجهود الدبلوماسية على كافة الأصعدة لدعم فرص السلام بالارتكاز للقانون الدولي. ونكرر أن اتفاقات مينسك لا تزال تشكل أساساً جيداً للوصول إلى حل سلمي للأزمة، وبما يحافظ على الأمن والاستقرار الإقليميين والدوليين. ثانياً، نشدد على ضرورة الالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة، لا سيما من حيث تسوية المنازعات الدولية بالوسائل السلمية، واحترام سيادة واستقلال الدول ووحدة أراضيها وسلامتها الإقليمية. إن الالتزام بهذه المبادئ والامتثال لميثاق الأمم المتحدة يعد ركيزة أساسية للتوصل لأي حل مستدام وسلمي للأزمة القائمة. ثالثاً، نكرر بأن الوضع المتأزم في شرق أوكرانيا قد يفاقم من الوضع الحرج للمدنيين، ناهيكم عن استمرار وجود تحديات تتعلق بإيصال المساعدات الإنسانية لبعض المحتاجين، لا سيما في المناطق القريبة من خط النزاع في شرق أوكرانيا، وذلك قبل حدوث التوترات الحالية. إن أي تصعيد آخر قد يؤدي لتفاقم الوضع الإنساني لعدد أكبر من المدنيين، وعليه نكرر أهمية العمل على خفض التصعيد ووقف إطلاق النار. ونهيب في هذا الشأن بجميع الأطراف بأهمية عدم التعرض للمساعدات الإنسانية والمدنيين في مناطق النزاع بما يتماشى مع التزاماتهما بموجب القانون الدولي. وختاماً السيد الرئيس، تجدد بلادي تأكيدها على أهمية وقف التصعيد واللجوء للحوار البناء ومواصلة العمل لإيجاد حلول سلمية تتسق مع القانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وشكراً.
Я благодарю
I thank the
представителя
representative of the
Объединенных
United
Арабских
Arab
Эмиратов и предоставляю
Emirates, and I
слово
now give the
представителю
floor to
Норвегии.
the representative of Norway.
President, I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their important statement. We are facing the dire prospect of a major war in Europe. Norway strongly condemns the decision by President Putin to send Russian troops into Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the latest announcements of special military operation. These decisions are unjustified, unprovoked, and irresponsible. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and in the vicinity of its internationally recognized borders. Our thoughts are with those who have already suffered too much due to this conflict, and with all those who are afraid that tomorrow will be a lot worse. We call upon all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law, which calls on the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in Ukraine. Like the Secretary General clearly stated, the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independent of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
despite being instructed to do so by the Americans, or suggested that he do so by the Americans, that he and the people will stand and fight. And that's what we've been hearing from the Ukrainian military and from people who were called up in the last few hours. They've gone from being civilians to now being soldiers having to fight on the front line. We have to wait and see what targets were struck here in Kiev. And been reports of explosions in other areas. What is the military objective here?
Stick with us here, Ian, because I'm getting word that we have some of what you've heard in the last couple of minutes here in Kyiv. Let's listen. Obviously, for any one of us who have covered conflict in the past, the distinct sound of bombs going off in the distance. And Ian, I want to bring you back in because we were talking about the Donbass and eastern Ukraine, these two separatist regions that are part of the Donbass region. That's quite a ways from where you are in Kyiv. And so to hear these explosions where you are in Kyiv obviously leads to this larger question about how big the size and scope of this operation.
Yes, absolutely. And that would be critical in terms of its bigger impact. I mean, in any case, whatever the scale of the military invasion that is now clearly underway, because President Putin has just announced it, is going to be devastating for this country. But if it is that larger invasion from Crimea in the south, this part of Ukraine that Russia annexed in 2014, and also from the east, again from the Russian city of Belgrade, its forces who gathered there, we felt that potentially they could move across into the east of the country, into the Donbass from there. And I think most worrying for the citizens of the capital from Belarus to the north, which is really only about 2 or 3 hours drive from the capital. That's unimpeded driving, of course. To get here, then that would be truly devastating. I mean, this is a large country, the largest country in Europe. All the warnings have been that you would see large numbers of casualties, large numbers of refugees.
For those of you watching, Ian, thank you, and stay with us here. We'll certainly come back to you. For those of you watching, Vladimir Putin has just declared to the Russian people that a special military operation is now underway. He urged members of the Ukrainian forces to lay down their arms. He told other countries not to interfere. This Russian military operation that U.S. authorities in the West had warned was coming is now, in fact, underway. I want to bring in our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, also reporting in. She's in Lviv, Ukraine tonight. And Martha, what are you learning from your sources?
Well, I have just been told, and it's quite obvious at this point, that it has indeed started. A senior Pentagon official told me that just a short time ago. This is the same Pentagon official who several hours ago texted me, David, I know I've shared it with all of you, and said, you are likely in the last few hours of peace on the European continent for a long time to come, adding a warning, be careful. Here in Lviv, we have not heard any sounds of any sort of strikes. We are on the border with Poland, about 50 miles from Poland here in the west, but certainly on alert for any type of action. I've also been told by other senior officials that there are Russian teams out throughout Ukraine looking for people. This is the playbook that the United States has given intelligence about over the past few weeks, how this would go down, that it would start with cyber attacks. We are hearing there are cyber attacks already beginning in Ukraine. Then we would have missile strikes, aerial strikes, and Russian troops moving forward. Again, we don't know exactly where those Russian troops will go, what they will do, how or when or if they will attack Kyiv, but it is something we're standing by for at the moment, David. Again, no sounds here yet of any sort of action, but we are braced for that.
Martha, you've been on the ground in Ukraine for several days now, and we have witnessed an extraordinary change in the temperature from the leadership of Ukraine just in the last couple of hours. The president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, addressing the Ukrainian people, actually revealing that he tried to reach out, tried to call Vladimir Putin today, that Putin did not take the call. And after days of saying his country should remain united tonight, he addressed the Russian people directly, saying, we do not want war, saying that the Russians have been watching a Ukraine that is not the real Ukraine, that the message from Putin that they're going to free Ukrainians, he said, we are a free people.
And he was met with silence, he said, when he tried to reach out to Vladimir Putin. Of course, President Zelensky several weeks ago and a week ago, really, was trying to tell people not to panic, that he didn't believe there was an invasion. So it really is a marked difference tonight. The U.S. has been trying to get President Zelensky to leave for his own safety. He obviously has not and is determined to stay, but that impassioned plea tells it all. He knows what's happening here tonight. He knows what is to come, a devastating war on the European continent, David.
Martha Raddatz, stay with us here as you have for many days now. I should mention that Secretary of State Antony Blinken told me earlier this evening that this orchestrated series of events, this request for Russian military help is exactly what the U.S. had predicted, telling me in the last 24 to 48 hours or so, Russia had been putting the final touches together to be ready for a full-scale invasion. And tonight, Ukraine's leader has put the country under a state of emergency in addition to that message, not only to the people of Ukraine, but as Martha and I were just talking about, to the people of Russia, saying what your leader, meaning Vladimir Putin, obviously what he's been telling you, how he has been describing Ukraine, is not the reality on the ground. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because we know President Biden is watching these developments, the Biden administration. And Cecilia, you heard Secretary Blinken tell me earlier that they did, in fact, believe this was imminent. There were more sanctions today related to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline after those harsh sanctions last night. And of course, the big question now is how President Biden will respond.
How and when, David, that is exactly right. We are waiting word from the president. We had been told by the White House earlier today that when they did believe this was a question of when this invasion would actually occur, that we would hear from the White House, from the president personally at some point after the fact. We do have a statement, a tweet from the press secretary, Jen Psaki. She says that the president is closely right now monitoring these developments there in Ukraine, that he's going to be receiving regular updates from his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan. He also just spoke with his UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, before she addressed the United Nations General Security Council meeting, that emergency meeting, that remarkable split screen of these diplomats imploring directly Vladimir Putin to not go through with this. The UN Secretary General looking directly in the camera and speaking to Putin, saying, please, the world is asking you to not do this, while Putin was on the split screen there in Moscow, basically declaring war right now. We are still swift and severe sanctions if Vladimir Putin decided to go through with this. Now we wait. The ball had been in Vladimir Putin's court. He decided to make this move, and now we wait to see what this White House does with that.
One thing the White House has been very clear about for many weeks now, Cecilia, is the fact that U.S. troops will not be sent into Ukraine. In fact, Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, reiterating that again today, saying we have no plans to be at war with Russia or putting any military troops on the ground in Ukraine to fight Russia, as we continue to hear more explosions in the background there in Kyiv, Cecilia.
That is a point, David, that this White House wants and needs the American public to know. They have no intention. The press secretary said today that the president does not have and will not decide under any circumstance to send American troops on the ground across the border into Ukraine. There are thousands of troops there on an assist level in the region. They do not, the White House says they will not cross over into this conflict. The president himself made a very eerie comment. He said, if you see American troops in combat with Russian soldiers, that would be blood. That would mean World War III. He has no intention of doing that. He has made that clear. And David, we talked about those polls. This is not what Americans want to see. They want minimal engagement in this conflict there.
Cecilia Vega is standing by in Washington following the Biden administration and any potential response we might get from President Biden tonight or in the coming hours to what we're seeing playing out. I do want to ask the control room if we have that video, because we are beginning to hear a series of explosions. We took a moment to hear it earlier. I just wanted to play for you some of what they're hearing in Ukraine now, a few hours before the sun comes up. It is 5:23 in the morning in Ukraine. The sun has not come up. We had been told by senior defense officials with the U.S. that likely this operation would begin under the cover of darkness. We'd also been told that they are expecting some difficult weather in the coming days and that likely Vladimir Putin would move in this particular time period, given the weather conditions on the ground and before sunrise allows them to get this operation started before the Ukrainian people have a chance to recognize what's playing out in their own country. We do know that Western journalists in Kharkiv, now this is a city, it's the second largest city in Ukraine, it's north of the Donbass region, that they are also hearing explosions there as well. And so we have Ian Panel in Kyiv, of course, the capital of Ukraine, where they're hearing explosions in Kharkiv. And you can see it on the map there. If you look just off to the right, you can see the Donbass, those two regions that were declared, suddenly declared independent by Vladimir Putin in the last couple of days. Those are in that area right there. It was suspected that it was most likely that Russian troops that had amassed along the border, 150,000 troops or so in the north, the east, and the south, but there in the east, that they would enter the Donbass region. The big question was whether or not this operation would be much larger than that. The fact that you're hearing explosions in Kyiv, and again, just north of that region, you can see it there on the map, Kharkiv, would signal that this operation is a large one. We don't know if it's as large as U.S. authorities had feared, but it is certainly much larger than just simply entering the Donbass from the east. I should mention that we've also learned tonight that civilian flights over Ukraine have been restricted, particularly over northeastern Ukraine there. This is believed The restriction came after a warning from Russia to flights entering these areas that they do so at their own risk. We also know that a no-fly notice had been issued for the Kharkiv airport. That's the city just to the north of the Donbass, where I said they're hearing explosions as well at this hour. As I mentioned, the second largest city in Ukraine, after the Ukrainian military reported Russia may target Kharkiv in an attack. And in fact, tonight, these explosions would signal that, in fact, is the case. You heard Martha mention earlier that U.S. authorities had urged President Zelensky to leave Kyiv. But in addressing the Ukrainian people, he made it very clear that he was staying put, at least for now. James Longman, our foreign correspondent in Moscow, listening to Vladimir Putin these last couple of days, his address to the Russian people, making the case for moving in, declaring those two separatist regions independent. And James, Vladimir Putin coming back on television in Russia just tonight, declaring a special military operation now underway. And he told Ukrainians to lay down their arms.
That's right, David. And I think the choreography of this was really rather extraordinary. The timing of this message, just as the United Nations Security Council was meeting, and actually just as the gavel went down after the Russians stopped speaking, we heard those explosions in Kiev. They know how to send a message. This is about undermining international cooperation. That is what Vladimir Putin has sought to do for years. And he's done that because he wants to divide his enemies in order that he can carry out his objectives. And we heard in that statement he gave earlier today, that word denazification, a loaded comment there. Very similar to the words he's been using around what he believes to be happening down in the eastern part of Ukraine. This word genocide, he's used it time and time again. This is about appealing to his people to say to them, this is not an offensive war, this is a defensive war. We are saving people in the Donbass. And he's warned off other foreign elements. He's saying to the rest of the world, don't come anywhere near us because we are in the process of saving the people of eastern Ukraine. Obviously, these comments bear no relation to what is actually happening in that country, but this was a message squarely for his own people. We just heard President Zelensky in Ukraine appeal to the Russian people, or Putin has done the same to his own people now. And we'll just have to see just how far he wants to go into the country. He said he doesn't want to occupy the Ukrainian territory. That was one of the quotes from the speech he gave. What he believes that to mean, we will wait and see, because of course he doesn't really believe that Ukraine should exist. He would deny that if you asked him, but from what he's been saying all week, that speech he gave earlier this week, very, very clear that he believes in rebuilding some kind of Russian empire. And if you just look at what's been going on in this country and the region over the last 10 to 15 years, this is very much part of a path, the trajectory that he has been on. In 2008, the war in Georgia, where again, he sought to move the Russian military into an area that he had declared independent. The annexation of Crimea, this is part of Vladimir Putin's playbook. Is he the cold, calculated KGB former profiler, or is he a man bent on achieving his true objective, which is to rebuild the Russian Empire? Could he be both of those things? It was a very, very scary speech, David.
Just an extraordinary split screen playing out on the world stage. The reality that Vladimir Putin is trying to present to the Russian people versus what the West has signaled to the world for several weeks now about Vladimir Putin's plans in Ukraine. I should mention we're hearing sirens now going off in Kyiv, of course, the capital of Ukraine, in addition to bombs, explosions off in the distance, both in Kyiv and in Kharkiv, which is north of the Donbass region. All of that playing out at this hour. We also are aware of this emergency meeting at the United Nations. You can hear the explosions there in the distance. The UN Security Council meeting at this hour, and the U.S. ambassador to the UN had already told the UN General Assembly just today that Vladimir Putin has asked the world to travel back in time by more than 100 years to an age of empires. And Martha Raddatz back with us tonight. And Martha, I am just struck that what authorities here in the U.S. had warned would happen, the sequence of events that they prepared the American people for, and much of the world for that matter, have begun to play out in exactly the sequence that they had predicted.
It certainly has, David. And the administration kept saying, I hope we are wrong. I hope this invasion does not happen. But it appears clearly they were right. It's happening. You know, David, we were walking around the city today and people were out. Right now, the city is dark. People will be waking up to this. I'm sure word is starting to spread about what's happening, and they'll wake up to see their nightmare, that their country has been invaded by the Russians. There was an absolute sense of disbelief here for many days, but it is indeed a reality right now.
And it's one
David.
that they'll continue to wake up as the sun comes up over Ukraine. And as you mentioned, Martha, to learn that the Russians are attacking their country. And let's bring in retired Colonel Stephen Ganyard, who's standing by with us tonight. And Stephen, you and I have talked for days here about the potential for this full-scale invasion and what that might look like, and whether or not it would expand beyond the Donbass. And just the fact that our reporter in Kyiv, Ian Pannell, is hearing explosions, that Western journalists in Kharkiv are also reporting explosions, in addition to those troops that had already amassed along the Donbass. So talk us through what you think could be playing out at this hour.
Yeah, David, as you mentioned, you and I have been talking about this buildup, this massive buildup on three sides of Ukraine. What's not on the map are the 20 ships down here that are capable of an amphibious landing. We know that the Russians have over 400 Iskander surface-to-surface missiles arrayed around the country to cover 95% of this country. So the initial strikes that we think we're hearing right now, right out of the Russian playbook, would be cruise missiles to take out things like surface-to-air missile systems, air defense systems that the Ukrainians would have. That would clear the path for waves of bombers and attack aircraft to continue to hit things like power plants, command and control, internet command centers. So the whole idea here in these first hours will be to create confusion, to separate the government from its people, to separate the government from their military, and to create the confusion that they hope will allow them to begin a ground invasion. That's what's anticipated. Where that comes and when is the question, and it will probably take us hours to see what happens and what Mr. Putin's true goal is in a ground invasion.
Steve Ganyard with us, tracking the potential scenarios that we could watch play out in the coming hours. We're just learning that there's a statement coming in from the White House. Let's go back to Cecilia for that. Cecilia?
David, the president is saying that, of course, he is praying for the people of Ukraine tonight, but perhaps he is really pointing this directly at Vladimir Putin. President Putin, quote, has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. The world will hold Russia accountable. David, he will be meeting with G7 allies in the morning. He says that he will be speaking to the American people to announce further consequences. And that, of course, is those sanctions, what the White House has been describing, some of the most severe sanctions ever levied. We expect to hear from the White House tomorrow. David.
Cecilia, thank you. Again, you're watching ABC News live coverage of what Russia is calling a special military operation, what U.S. authorities in the West will likely call an invasion. And a full-scale invasion was what they had been warning of all day, saying it was imminent given the intelligence on the ground. Vladimir Putin announcing that this military operation, claiming it's intended to protect civilians. But before we go off the air for now, I did want to check back in with Ian Pannell, our chief foreign correspondent there in Kyiv. And Ian, given the juxtaposition of Putin's words intended to protect civilians, I'm struck by what we heard from the Pentagon today, saying if he decides to conduct this invasion, this will be a war of choice and it won't be bloodless.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a dark day for Ukraine and it's a dark day for Europe. We're potentially now looking at the first conflict between two sovereign nation armies in Europe since the end of the Second World War. I think Ukrainians will start to wake up. They'll be hearing the news. They'll be hearing the explosions. Since we've been on air, we've heard at least 3 more distinct large explosions in the night sky here in Kiev. It's not possible to know exactly what's caused them or indeed what the targets are. But of course, against the backdrop of this effective declaration of war by Vladimir Putin, one would imagine that it could potentially be some kind of Russian airstrike. But it's a dark day for the country and people will wake in a climate of fear. David.
Just an extraordinary scene that the people of Ukraine will wake up to. We can hear the sirens going off behind you. Our thanks to you, Ian. Again, Vladimir Putin declaring a special military operation. what the West is calling an invasion tonight of Ukraine. Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with this Russian action would lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen. The White House, as you heard from Cecilia, already reacting tonight with prayers for the Ukrainian people and warning that there will be consequences for Vladimir Putin having taken this action tonight. We're going to continue to monitor these developments. We'll be back on the air as soon as there is something major that develops. Our coverage will continue at ABC News Live, abcnews.com. Again, Nightline later tonight, and Good Morning America first thing in the morning. I'm David Muir here in New York. Thank you for watching. Good night.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
You know, we humans have come a long way on our journey. Our first language.
demilitarization of Ukraine, calling on Ukrainian soldiers to lay down their arms and go home. But it seemed those pleas have fallen on
incredibly complicated. With Jim's body on a ventilator, researchers essentially removed his kidneys and replaced them with ones from a gene-edited pig. The first time this has ever been done. These are organs coming from a pig, but there's a very specific reason why you've chosen this animal.
Absolutely. You know, pigs have a lifespan of around 30 years. So the idea is when you transplant these organs that they will be able to...
Allies trying to make Russia feel financial pain if any large-scale invasion takes place. All right, we have team coverage tonight of this developing situation. We start tonight with ABC's senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell. Ian, talk to us about what you're hearing and seeing right now.
Yeah, hi there. Good evening from New York and good morning here in Kiev. We heard a series of explosions over the last hour. I've counted something in the region of 7 or 8 large, distinct explosions around Kiev. They haven't been particularly visible other than a flash in the night sky. It's not clear what the targets are, but it certainly sounds like fairly heavy ordnance, and we'll just have to wait and see for an assessment and some reporting as to exactly what targets have been struck. But of course, this happened really within minutes of Vladimir Putin essentially finishing his declaration of war in Moscow. So I think the mood here is going to be dark this morning. I think Ukraine realizes that the worst is now coming to pass. Vladimir Putin in his speech clearly setting out large ambitions that go beyond this industrial area of eastern Ukraine in the Donbass where they currently are. The Ukrainian military has been on standby. We know there's a state of emergency. 36,000 reservists were called up in the last 24 hours. In fact, we were talking to one of those reservists who's now having to leave civilian life and to go to the front line. That is a reality. Ukrainians say, you know, our backs are to our country, to our families, to our neighborhoods, and we have nowhere else to go to. We will stand and fight. President Zelensky, of course, being urged by the Americans to leave Kiev, to head to the west, to Lviv, perhaps even to Poland for his own safety. They believe that he himself could be targeted by the Russians. Of course, he's refused to do that. And I think understandably so, because it would send a terrible signal to the Ukrainian people when you're asking them to stand and protect their countries. This has been a country that's been very calm in the face of such adversity, such threat from Russia. And now we'll see what that actually looks like here. This is a difficult morning. This is a difficult day, not just for Ukraine, but I think for many people here in Europe.
And Ian, the sun is going to come up soon. What happens now that we've seen this effective declaration of war by Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, I mean, we'll see what the response is from the Ukrainian government. We'll see what command and control they currently have. There had been fears that there would be a large-scale cyber attack. So far, that doesn't appear to have been the case. There was a cyber attack yesterday, but it was relatively limited to financial institutions and some government websites. We were fearing that potentially, you know, we would lose all power, lose all data. So far, that hasn't happened. The lights are still on across Kiev this morning. So we'll hear what President Zelensky has to say. One imagines he would probably want to address the Ukrainian people. He has options. He can put the country onto a war footing, which I would have thought is not unlikely in the next day or so. That would mean calling up even more reservists. The Ukrainian military has something like 250,000 standing members, but of course it faces technically a smaller force from Russia in terms of the numbers gathered on the border, but militarily far superior. I think they also have to wait and see where the attacks are taking place. Explosions also in Kharkiv. That's in the east of the country to the northern border together with Russia. Belgrade is the obvious Russian city over on the other side of that border there. There had been some suggested reports coming out of Crimea in the south, but those are unverified. And I'm afraid we're in that fog of war at the moment where there will be reports. Some of them will turn out not to be true. There will be claims. There will be black ops, if you like, conducted by propagandists. You know, we'll see this on social media. We'll see claims, false claims. And that's really what we've been seeing over the last few days, emanating from these statelets, if you like, in the east of the country, Russian-supported statelets, making totally false unverified accusations against Ukrainian military that they are about to attack. And late into the evening, they appealed directly to Vladimir Putin for support, for protection. Again, entirely bogus claims. And that seems to be what Vladimir Putin answered. But I think if you listen to the frankly rather scary words of Vladimir Putin, I think that should give everybody pause for caution and pause for thought, because the suggestion there is that this won't be small, it won't be limited, it won't just be in a limited area, that the worst case scenario, which is what the Biden administration has been warning us will come to pass, may well now be unfolding. But we just have to wait a little longer and see what's really happening.
A lot more to monitor. Thank you, Ian, and stay safe. Let's bring in James Longman now from Moscow. James, can you walk us through that late night announcement from Putin announcing that military operation that happened during the same time as UN diplomats were asking Putin to give peace a chance?
Yeah, that's right, Andrew. It was the choreography of this was just extraordinary. You know, Putin really does know how to sell a message, and his message is that he doesn't believe in international cooperation. You know, at the moment of his announcement, the Russian gavel went down in the United Nations Security Council. The ambassador stopped speaking, and then you heard the first bombs in Kiev. I mean, it was just an absolutely extraordinary split screen. And we heard from the Russian president. He said, "I have decided to conduct a special military operation. Its goal is to protect people who have been subjected to bullying and genocide by the Kiev regime for 8 years. And for this, we will strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine." I mean, these words, denazification, genocide, they are loaded, they are emotive words, and they have been words used repeatedly by this government in order to justify what they are now doing in Ukraine. This is being packaged as a defensive operation, not an offensive one. The whole way through this, Vladimir Putin has argued that the people of eastern Ukraine need Russia's help in order to protect them from Kiev, and he calls it a regime here, the democratically elected government of Kiev. And so, you know, this is just exactly the same message we've heard time and time again. The question is how far he goes into the country. You know, we will just have to wait and see. But it was very, very scary from Vladimir Putin. And it's just part of a trajectory that he's been on for some years. If you think back to 2008, the war in Georgia, where areas of that country were annexed, and then he sent in the military to secure them. The same happened in Crimea in 2014. And so, you know, this is very much a president who sees himself as a man who wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. He actually earlier this week said that that wasn't what his ambitions were. He'd heard in the media, I think, probably, and from world leaders, that this had been the challenge to him, that he was somehow hell-bent on recreating a Russian empire. He said, that's not what it is. I'm just defending my homeland, and I'm defending people in eastern Ukraine. But the evidence is clearly that this is exactly what he's doing. And as we heard there from Ian, you know, it is not just now going to be the eastern parts of Ukraine that will be his focus. It may well be the rest of the country, because we heard in that speech back on Monday, he doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist. You know, he believes that this is a country which is within the former USSR and the former Russian Empire. So I think it's very, very scary, honestly, the language that he was using, and we'll just have to wait and see what exactly happens next. Andrew?
And what about the relationship between these two nations? Can you describe to us how everyday Russians view their Ukrainian neighbors? And do you think Russians expected this to happen? Describe for us how this has been reported in Russia, if you will.
Well, I don't think Russians did expect this to happen, to be honest. I mean, obviously, it depends who you ask, but there's been a sort of level of sort of suspended disbelief about the possibility of invasion. There have been moments where people have been scared or shocked by a development. I think Vladimir Putin's original speech, when he addressed the nation, saying, you know, it sounded like a president who was preparing his nation for war. I think the law that passed here in the parliament, which gave permission for the army to go into a foreign country, that was the same law that was passed in 2014 to allow the annexation of Crimea. That got people thinking here, I think. And of course, that televised Security Council meeting, that has never happened before. So there have been moments that have broken through the suspended disbelief. But most of all, I think people just a lot of them didn't think this was going to happen. People regard Ukrainians as their brothers. They have a shared history, a shared culture. Vladimir Putin said that. Of course, he uses that as a reason that it shouldn't exist. Regular Russians, a lot of them will have very strong ties to Ukraine, and they'll be waking up now really, I think, very worried about what is happening. But they will be told, as they have been so far, that this is not an offensive military operation. This is the defensive one. So there will be a sense of reluctantly accepting the need to enter Ukraine rather than supporting a president who is hell-bent on rebuilding a Russian empire. They have been told time and time again, this is happening because NATO is a threat. The West is supporting Ukraine. Ukraine will join NATO. We will have yet another country that is allied with other countries throughout Europe and the United States against Russia, and we cannot have that. We've had these wild accusations, for example, that the United States is going to help Ukraine launch a nuclear weapon against Russia. I mean, these are messages that they've heard repeatedly, and not just in the last few days. These have been over the last 8 years to kind of sell the idea that that these operations in eastern Ukraine should continue, or that at least the Russians there should, the Russian speakers should be supported by people here in the Russian Federation. So this is not old news for Russians waking up this morning, the arguments anyway, but I think it'll be shock that this has actually happened.
James, thank you. And let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. Thank you again for joining us. A senior Pentagon official says that this is the start of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is there any way to back away from the brink here, or are we at the point of no return?
I think we've passed the point of no return. I think the attacks that President Putin has announced and that we've started to hear from not just Kharkiv, but even in Kyiv, that's amazing. It's far distant from the border. And even we've heard some reports from the southern part of Ukraine, south of the occupied territories of Donbass. So we're past the point of going back. He's attacked. Putin has no justification for this. There is no indication whatsoever that he was able to find a justification. He was looking for one. He was hoping that he would have some rationale, something that he could point to that says, oh, the Ukrainians are attacking. He never got that. The Ukrainians were so disciplined to not respond to the provocations. And so now President Putin is left with no rationale. He has undertaken an unprovoked attack on a neighbor. This is criminal. He will go down in history badly for this.
And now, as that invasion is underway, if you were still the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, what would you be doing right now?
So I would be making it clear to the Ukrainian government that we're strongly supporting them. We support their sovereignty. We support their right to fight back. We have been providing weapons and ammunition, training, and equipment, and we will continue to do that. The Ukrainian government will now have to decide how it responds. It's clearly going to fight. The Ukrainian military is prepared for this. It's not a match. It is clearly not a match for the Russian military, but the Ukrainian military will exact a very high price. There will be Russian soldiers who will be killed if they come across the border, if they follow up these missile attacks or artillery attacks or aerial bombardments, which must be going on right now. If they follow those up with attacks across the border by infantry or artillery or tanks, they will pay the price. So the Ukrainian military will fight hard.
You mentioned that the U.S. military is helping with weapons, ammo, equipment. Is there any point of escalation where that might also include U.S. troops?
So far, no indication at all of U.S. troops. The Ukrainians have not asked for U.S. troops, and President Biden has been very clear that he doesn't have the intent to send U.S. troops into Ukraine. Now, what he has done, what President Biden has done, is move U.S. forces from. they go about that is not yet clear. And so President Zelensky, who has stood up to President Putin very clearly, very strong, very resolute, he's going to have to continue to do that. He's going to have to rally his nation to fight and resist the Russians as they come across.
Now, as all this is happening, the UN is still in an emergency meeting discussing the crisis in Ukraine right now, many pleading for Russia to pull back. What can UN diplomats actually achieve?
Not very much. Sad to say that the Security Council, because it has a veto power for the Russians to use, the Security Council cannot act. So it is not able to stop. It wasn't able to stop the invasion in 2014. The Russians invaded Ukraine, of course, in 2014. Security Council met, and the Russians vetoed the condemnation. It was very interesting. The Chinese, even the Chinese, abstained from that. Be interesting to see what the Chinese do this time. I would imagine that Security Council will propose that the United States will propose a resolution that condemns this attack, this unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation in violation of the UN Security Council and the UN Charter. And I imagine that the Russians will veto it. So that will then set the stage for another conversation in the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, which doesn't have the ability to actually do things, but it can say things, it will vote to condemn Russia, but is not able to stop this fight.
And with that said, so much of this surrounds the possibility of Ukraine applying for NATO membership. Why is that such an issue for Russian President Vladimir Putin?
It's a great question. It is a great question. Everyone knows, including Vladimir Putin, that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO today or tomorrow or even next year. So why he is invading to stop something that's not going to happen anytime soon, that makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's totally unjustified. There is no answer to your question. It's a good question, and there's no answer.
Realistically here, what's the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is a massive invasion by these 200,000 or more troops that the Russians have massed around Ukraine. It will be a terrible, bloody fight. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians will be killed, military and civilian. Thousands of Russians will be killed, military. They will go back. Your reporter in Moscow raised the right question. Do the Russian people really support this massive invasion? I doubt it. I doubt it. In particular, when their brothers and fathers and sons come back killed and they have to be buried in the Russian towns. It is not. There is very likely to be an opposition, a strong opposition, even within Russia, to this. So President Putin is taking a great risk.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, thank you for your time and your insight. All right, with us now is ABC News contributor and retired Colonel Steve Ganyard. Putin just announced that Russia will conduct a military operation in eastern Ukraine. What does that mean, and is this a declaration of war?
It is, Andrew. Now, what that war entails, that's the big question, and that's what we're having to piece together in these minutes as the opening salvos are fired. Just reading a report from our person on the ground in Moscow, something very interesting, and let's think about what Mr. Putin might be doing. So if we look at the map here, we know that Ukrainian intelligence today talked about that the city of Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, about 1.4 million people, was one of Russia's targets. They also said this little town down here called Kherson is the other target. So we said, why would those be the two? This is the port city that empties on to the Black Sea, controls all of this key economic waterway that Putin, if he held this, would be able to squeeze Ukraine in a way that he could essentially economically strangle the country. So if they attack here and if they attack here, the other thing we just heard was explosions in a town called Dnipro, which is right here. So if you draw a line here from Kharkiv to Dnipro, that would be the only thing that the Russian army would have to take. And then this waterway, the Dnieper River, forms a natural boundary. So now Putin could carve off essentially 1/3 of eastern Ukraine and be able to control the river and all of the exports that go down the river into the Black Sea, All of their domestic gas production is here. And this is one of the richest agricultural areas in the world. So if Putin's looking for a prize, Kharkiv, Dnipro, all the way down to Kherson as the forces come up from Odessa, and he owns this part of it. Whether he goes after Kyiv itself, we'll wait and see. Only has about 30,000 troops up here to the north. That's a city of almost 4 million people if you take in the suburbs. So that's a tough thing. But we do know that what Mr. Putin wants is to teach the Ukrainian government a lesson, and if he can, to bring them down and create a puppet government in Kiev.
And tonight we've heard the sound of explosions in Ukraine. Help lay this out for us. What could a military operation look like? What does it include? Attacks on the ground, missiles in the air? What would this actually look like?
Yeah, we don't know, but what we do know is the Russian playbook. So the first thing that you do in a major invasion like this, where you are attacking a country with very capable surface-to-air missile systems, air defense systems, you would send in cruise missiles and surface-to-surface missiles in all those places where they had missiles that could take down your airplanes. Once the skies are clear, then they'll launch more surface-to-surface missiles that are very accurate, could go after critical infrastructure, power plants, things like that, equipment areas, military command and control. Now that you have the skies clear and you have initial air defense taken out, now you can bring in your bombers, you bring in your attack aircrafts, and you pound the Ukrainian army from the air with no ability to defend themselves. At some point, given all the array of military ground forces we see here, Mr. Putin will come in to Ukraine in some way with some intent. Again, don't know if he wants to go after Kyiv and bring down the government here, or whether he wants to carve off this eastern part of the country. Remember that this is the rebel-held area of Donbass, but this is not all of the Donbass. All of the Donbass goes way out here. The rebel-held area is only about a third of the Donbass. So if he said, I need to go in and retake the Donbass, he's got some work to do in here. But again, a line from Kharkiv to Dnipro down to Kherson would give him that 1/3 of the country, and maybe that's enough.
And Russia seems to have struck first here. So how can Ukraine respond? Are they prepared militarily to respond to a Russian invasion?
They are much improved. The U.S. and NATO countries have been working with them to improve their military since they were whipped in 2014 by the Russians in the Crimea and in the Donbass. So they've gotten better. The problem is the Russian military has also gotten much better. Over the last 15 years or so, Mr. Putin has put a lot of money into improving the Russian military in a way that makes them a very, very capable military, once again, in sort of reflecting that past glory of the Cold War. That means that the Ukrainians, even though they sort of match up man for man on the ground, it still means that the technological advantages that the Russian army, Russian military, Russian Air Force has really is going to be no match. So will Mr. Putin be able to take large parts of Ukraine? Yes, it may take weeks, it may take months, but eventually he'll be able to do that. What he will not be able to do is be able to hold that territory. You think about it, it takes about 3 to 1 in terms of the number of troops. So if he has 150, 170,000 troops around here, if he's going to even hold this much of Ukraine, he's going to need double or triple that, and he can't afford that. He goes into an election in 2 years from now and can't have body bags coming home from some bloody occupation like he saw in Chechnya. So it's probably going to be a get in, get out. I think we heard that tonight where he says he doesn't want to hold terrain, wants to teach the government a lesson. What that lesson is yet to be seen.
For the Ukrainians' defense, how does the mobilization of reservists help?
Because really what they're going to have to do is fight sort of a militia, an insurgency. So remember, we saw insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan that we had to fight. It's actually quite difficult because you have people who believe in the defense of their country, that they've been invaded by a country. They're very proud that the national spirit of Ukraine has grown since the independence in 1991 from Russia. So you have Russians invading and killing Ukrainians. And so what they're going to have to do after they eventually get overrun is to sort of go into the militias and fight a guerrilla war. And that ends up being very, very bloody, not only for the Ukrainians, but eventually for the Russians.
And Colonel, last question here. American troops are overseas right now. What kind of support could they provide Ukraine, and how will they engage?
Zero. It'll be the President Biden has made it very clear that this is not our fight. So Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's never going to be a member of NATO. Someday, maybe it'll be a member of the EU, but it is not our fight. It's not NATO's fight, but it is still very, very concerning. If you think about it, Andrew, this part of the world has a really bad track record for small world wars turning into brush fires and world wars. So it's one of these things that needs to be watched because there's a lot of historical overhang here that's quite scary.
Colonel Gander, thank you for that insight. And we'll be back after this break with more reporting from the ground in Ukraine and our team of analysts to break all of this down. Stay with us.
The most powerful stories of our time, anytime. Nightline.
It's an extraordinary story.
A computer salesman was supposed to report to prison to begin a 17-year sentence.
They let him turn himself into jail with no escort.
No one thought he would run.
How do you evade capture for 25 years? How do you do that?
Now, join the search, following the U.S. Marshals as they uncover new leads in a global manhunt. Can you help catch this fugitive?
Have you seen this man?
Have you seen this man?
Have you seen this man? Listen and join the all-new hunt wherever you get your podcasts.
Now streaming on ABC News Live 2020. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues. The Hunt. True crime 2020. Now streaming on ABC News Live.
National parks are incredibly safe places. A crime will happen.
Hey, Mama. My wife is fallen. She's in really critical condition.
At that time, I thought it was just a tragic accident. There's still a lot of questions we need to ask.
There were small things that didn't totally add up.
This is 2 lives for Harold that have died now. I was shocked. Something's not right.
They were a killing team.
A mother and daughter poisoning their family members.
I mean, this is unheard of. Who does that?
I knew they were drinking antifreeze.
What? Nobody just drinks antifreeze.
It's incredible.
She's never talked publicly until now. How is it that you could kill your own family?
There's more to that than what people know.
What is the truth, Diane?
The new 2020, Friday at 9/8 Central on ABC.
I know what happened, and I'm not guilty.
Why the fascination with criminal trials? Figure out what's really out there.
She revealed she had murdered his family.
I know in my heart they did this.
It's the time of suspicion. The ending's really tough.
You don't know whether truth is going to be difficult to find unless you try to find it.
This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're gonna move out. Let's move out.
We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
Run, urgent delivery, run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
Welcome back, and let's get right to that breaking news from Ukraine. Let's bring in ABC's Aaron Katersky in Lviv in the west of Ukraine. Aaron, there have already been reports of blasts to your east. What's happening there in Ukraine right now, and what are you seeing?
Well, it appears that Russian forces have struck deep into this country as something of an opening salvo, Andrew. The invasion is underway, as the Pentagon put it to our Martha Raddatz. It has started, and it started, it seems, with reports of troops coming across the Russian border in Kharkiv, which is in the east of Ukraine and the country's second largest city. And it also started with bombs dropping in Kyiv, in the capital city, as heard by our team there. Elsewhere in Ukraine, I mean, who knows? We're not sure what this full scale of the invasion is going to look like over the next several days or weeks, or how long it could last, or what President Putin's intentions are. But we know the U.S. Military is in neighboring countries now, and the Ukrainian military
had said that it was bracing key members of parliament here in Ukraine that the invasion was going to include Kyiv, the capital, and at least one other major city. And if that's Kharkiv to the east, it would make sense because it is the second largest city, home to about 1.5 million people or so. And it could help President Putin, if this is his intention, try and claim the eastern third of the country, cut it off from the capital to prevent Ukrainian troops from falling back to defend it.
Let's go back to how this all started. It was a slow buildup to a possible attack. Were the Ukrainian people prepared for this?
Well, they had not necessarily been put on a war footing, but today a tone changed as President Zelensky started calling up reservists, 36,000 of them, to reinforce the Ukrainian military. He also got on the phone with world leaders, President Biden included in recent days, appealing for financial support and other support for the Ukrainian military. And the country's National Security Council called for a state of emergency, and that's to allow authorities to impose curfews or limit transport, do other things to try and get ahead of any threats that may arise. And that was a real signal that they thought something was coming. And then the Ukrainian military began to brief members of parliament, telling them that an invasion was coming and coming soon, and preparing them that it was going to be much bigger than the fighting that we've seen in this country for the last 8 years in eastern Ukraine.
And Aaron, you mentioned the calling up of reservists. How else has the country ensured that its people are going to be safe?
Well, they have certainly been well aware of the warnings from the United States and its European partners, Andrew. They know what the dire warnings have sort of built up. And although there's really been no outward sign of panic here, we know that in more recent days in talking to people, that they've begun to sense that something was up and privately may have begun to make plans. I visited a gun shop here in Lviv, and the manager was telling me that he's had a good deal of interest in recent days, people coming in wanting to know about firearms for self-defense or to protect their families. We've also heard of Ukrainians taking up arms in preparation to fight the Russians, should it come to that. There's a good sense of patriotism here. It's a country of 40 million people, and they are not going to go down without a fight. As President Zelensky had said, the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military are ready for whatever Vladimir Putin may have in store.
And now that a Russian invasion appears to be underway, have there been any evacuations?
We haven't really heard of any, and it seems as if that this feared mass exodus to Poland may not have started, but it's very early in this conflict, and indeed the busier direction at the crossing with Poland seemed to be the other way, as Ukrainians wanted to come back to their country, even knowing that something may be afoot. President Zelensky made a last-ditch appeal to try and avoid hostilities. He did it in Russian to Russians, well aware that his voice may never have been heard in Russia proper, but he wanted to get a message out to say that Ukraine wants peace, that it is not the aggressor that it has been portrayed in Russia in recent days. And he was hoping to sort of mobilize Russian support against what President Putin is doing, even though he undoubtedly knew it would fall on deaf ears.
And Ukraine's president made a plea for peace today, even saying that he tried to call Putin and was met with silence. How have the Ukrainian people reacted to their leadership in this trying time?
You know, I think there's been something of a rallying around Zelensky. He is the democratically elected leader, and although he's a political novice, having come from the world of entertainment, he's been doing all of the things a president can do. He's been urging calm, and indeed we haven't seen any signs of anything but in the last more recent hours, he has started to make his people aware of perhaps what's to come. And now our teams have heard the explosions in the capital of Kyiv. Zelensky has been urged by the United States to leave the capital for his own safety, but we believe he is still there, although he has sent parliamentarians back to their constituencies to be with the people.
Aaron, thank you, and be safe. Now, there will no doubt be economic impacts from what's happening overseas tonight, globally and here in the United States. So we turn to ABC's Elizabeth Schulze for more. Elizabeth, there have already been sanctions announced. Has the White House indicated yet how they will respond to this particular escalation?
Well, Andrew, the White House has released a statement from President Biden that called this an unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine and vowing that the world will hold Russia accountable. So what that will look like is these severe economic penalties that they have been teeing up in case this type of invasion happens. We do know that so far the sanctions have been pretty targeted, focused on a few Russian banks, on the financial system, on oligarchs. This next round, the White House has said, will be coordinated again with its allies and could include broader measures, things like export controls, which would make it difficult for Russia to get access to critical technologies. They're talking about targeting bigger banks that could affect more Russian households, the broader Russian economy, and the possibility of personal sanctions on President Putin hasn't been completely ruled out. You know, ultimately, the attempt here is to show that we have a lot of measures that we can still take that will severely cripple the economy. The U.S. says it's prepared to do this with its allies, and President Biden is expected to make this announcement in a public address tomorrow, Andrew.
And how much could tonight's attack further rock the financial markets?
Well, if there's one thing the stock market doesn't like, it's uncertainty, and this is a big dose of it. We are already seeing stock market futures trade lower, and those losses have accelerated as the scope of this has become more clear. You know, one of the biggest questions for traders is how long is this going to last? And of course, we don't know that at this point. So a lot of traders tell me that you can expect very choppy and bumpy trading in the coming days, maybe weeks, as we try to kind of look at how this is going to play out. Some of those safe haven assets like gold, where a lot of investors go when times of uncertainty, are trading higher. And of course, oil prices are trading higher now in the wake of this announcement. That is one of the key things we're watching when it comes to the effect on the Russian economy and on the overall economy, too.
And this could have a real and immediate impact on Americans. We're already seeing a lot of pain at the pump. How high could gas and energy prices go from here? And are these price hikes expected to last?
This is the question. We are seeing, Andrew, already Brent crude oil prices close to $100 a barrel in the wake of this news tonight. That means that the price that you are going to pay at the gas pump could eventually go higher with crude oil prices going higher. So, you know, remember, Russia is the third largest producer, exporter of crude oil in the world, the second largest exporter of natural gas. A lot of this is going to mean that European consumers pay higher prices at the pump or in their heating bills, especially if what Russia decides to do is retaliate in response to these sanctions that we expect to be announced by the U.S. and by its allies. If Russia then decides to pull back supply from the market to further disrupt the oil market, that could mean that there's more disruption for consumers here, and that could result in higher prices. You know, we've already seen prices go up so much. Gas prices are up 20 cents for the national average gallon of gas here in the U.S., and a lot of analysts say you can expect to see $4 gallon of gas if we continue to see these oil prices trending higher, Andrew.
And Elizabeth, is there anything the Biden administration can do to try to mitigate the economic fallout here in the U.S.?
You know, this is a message that the White House has been trying to send, saying we understand that Americans will bear some of the pain of these measures that we are imposing. And part of that is the cost of democracy, they say. But on the other hand, inflation is already a problem here in the U.S. It's already pinching Americans. So they've tried to say we're making a coordinated effort, the U.S. with other countries around the world, to stock up on oil reserves in case Russia does decide to pull back, to stock up on natural gas reserves, to try to say we are prepared, we have enough ready to go to subvert some of the shocks that could be in place here in the market. At the same time, the U.S. isn't ruling out other options like releasing oil from its strategic petroleum reserve. This is something that it did earlier this year when we saw gas prices going up. How much of an effect that will have for the average person going to fill up at the tank, not very clear at this point. And ultimately, this is a global market. So when there are big shocks and big disruptions like this, it does trickle down to the consumer, you and me here at home. Andrew.
Elizabeth Schulze there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. Let's turn now to ABC News contributor and retired General Robert Abrams. General Abrams was an advisor to former U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel during the last invasion of Ukraine, and more recently was the head of U.S. forces in Korea. Thank you, General. Okay, so U.S. defense officials were expecting this invasion to come tonight under the cover of night. Why this timing? Why in the dark? And was this meant to be a surprise attack?
Well, I think the timing, there's a lot of factors on the timing. and you've touched on a couple of them. Historically and typically, military operations, we like to initiate them under the cover of darkness. The advantage goes to the attacker. And it's when it disrupts people's circadian rhythm. It's disruptive to people's sleep cycles, the Ukrainian military people's sleep cycles, and so forth. So striking during the hours of darkness gives the advantage to the attacker. Why today, I think, is tied to several factors. I think the weather had something to do with it. Weather fairly good today across the country, not as good in the east. But as I've said a number of times, the weather factor swings in both directions. It may not have been ideal for the attacker, but it's not ideal for the defender either. And so I think that was probably a neutral state of play between the attacker and the defender. I think there's some symbolism on starting it today. This is the Russian Army Day of Remembrance. And I think there's in Putin's mind, there was a little symmetry there to be able to initiate this defense of Russian people in eastern Ukraine on the same day. So I think many of those things played into his decision to launch his attack today.
What do you expect the Russian military forces to do in the coming hours? It's just after 6 a.m. in Ukraine. What could morning look like?
Well, look, I think we need to pay attention to what Putin said. What he said was, we're going to do a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine and denazify Ukraine. So I think we should kind of step back away from the tactics of what we can expect to see. I think he's made a declarative statement that he intends to destroy or completely disarm the Ukrainian military, and it will not be limited to one part of the country. When he says demilitarize, that means destroy or disarm their capability to defend themselves. And then on the denazification, I think that's not a veiled threat. That is a clear, unambiguous threat to the leadership, the elected governmental officials of Ukraine, that he intends to replace them. What we should be asking is, if Putin and Russia is successful, how does this end? How does he put his own government, somebody who is sympathetic to Russia, who will be a puppet for Putin and the Russian regime? How will that play out? But I think he has signaled to Ukraine and signaled to the international community what his true intentions are here.
And let's go back to the aid for Ukraine. How much could the military assets provided by the U.S., like those Javelin missiles, help Ukraine in a conflict with a country like Russia?
So the Javelin missiles and other arms and ammunition that are being provided by other NATO countries will be enormously helpful to the Ukrainian military. But as Steve pointed out earlier, the Ukrainian military is good. They're very good, and they're a lot better than they were in 2014. But unfortunately, size does matter, and numbers do matter when it comes to squaring these two countries up against each other. And Russia has a decisive advantage in a couple of areas. They have it in surface-to-surface missiles. They have it in combat aircraft. They have it in combat helicopters. And that is something that Ukraine just does not have, and it puts them at a military disadvantage. So I suspect, and I fully expect, that the Ukrainian military will put up a very stiff defense. But we're looking at some very tough days. The amount of firepower that Russia has aligned against the Ukrainian military right now is enormous. And I would expect us to see it completely unleashed here in the next 24 hours.
Some tough days ahead. General Abrams, thank you. Let's bring in former Homeland Security official and ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman now. Today, Ukraine experienced some smaller scale cyber attacks, but Russia is capable of much larger cyber attacks. Talk about what those could look like.
Right. So today we initially saw some DDoS attacks, those are denial of service attacks, which think about not being able to access your bank or a government website where you need some information. It's disruptive, but it's not really of the size and scale that we expect. But then later this afternoon, we actually got word that some malware had been released. It's a data wipe malware, and it had infected, reports are up to hundreds of computers in Ukraine, and the damage that that type of attack can cause could be significant depending on which places were targeted. And what some of the cyber experts are postulating, it's all pretty early to deduce everything, but they think that the DDoS attacks may have been launched to be able to distract from the other activities embedding this malware in networks. So it is very possible and likely that we will see more attacks kind of unfurl over the next few days, and with a particular focus on Ukraine. And the purpose of those is to try to cause more disruption, and in particular, damage and disrupt the ability to communicate with the public, as well as to exercise command and control of the military and organizing your response as a government. So I would expect to see more of those. We might also see attacks on infrastructure, taking out the energy grid. They actually did this to Ukraine back in 2015, took out power for about 1 to 6 hours for about 230,000 people. And we know that Russia has pretty significant capabilities. So I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg at this point.
Bringing this full circle, there's serious concern about the prospect of cyber attacks right here in the United States by the Russian government. What is the likelihood that could actually happen?
I think it's pretty significant. You've seen DHS and the Department of Justice actively try to raise the alarm about potential cyber attacks, and they've been doing this for months. They've been putting out bulletins. They've been holding calls with state and local officials, with private businesses, with the banks, anybody that is an owner or operator of critical infrastructure with a particular focus on finance, communications, internet, energy, oil and gas. We are very concerned that those businesses and critical infrastructure are going to be targeted, may already be in the process of being targeted, because of course in the way that cyber warfare is conducted, you often try to infiltrate, plant viruses, plant malware that is quiet and silent, and then you activate it when you need it. So the battlefield has probably already been prepped, and they've been trying to alert everybody to be on the lookout for suspicious activity, shields up, as they say. But from an American citizen standpoint, what does this mean for us? It could mean that we see disruptions. You remember that we had the Colonial Pipeline attack. It was a ransomware attack, a little bit different than probably what we would see in this circumstance. But it didn't take much. It didn't take much to shut down that pipeline, and disruptions to gas supplies occurred pretty quickly. Prices went up, and then there were parts of the country where there were lines and people had to wait for the gas tank to come and fill up the station in order for them to fill up their car. So those types of disruptions are very plausible. And we saw Putin kind of threaten that tonight. I do wonder if his threat to the US and to the West, that we may, if we involve ourselves in some way, we might see attacks of the like that we haven't ever seen in our history before. That could be a reference to cyber warfare. We really have not seen the full scale of what it would look like for the United States and Russia to go head to head from a cyber perspective, because of course, if they attack us, we have some offensive capability as well. We would likely retaliate. And where does that go? So the world's never seen that. And that is, that's a little disturbing. I think I know that the people in the United States government that manage those capabilities are very mindful of the precedent that entering into cyber conflict may set, and the dangers that might pose. But we will see how Russia chooses to handle itself.
A lot more to monitor. ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman, thank you. And now we want to check back in with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. Thank you for joining us again. Now, in a statement, the White House said that the president plans to deliver remarks tomorrow announcing further consequences for Russia. What could those further consequences be?
Andrew, he could pull out all the stops, and he should pull out all the stops. This is a major violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, major violation of international law, major invasion of a sovereign nation, in violation of everything that has kept the peace for all this time. And we have been very clear. President Biden has been very clear. The allies have been very clear that if he does this, if President Putin does this, which he has now done, that we will throw all of these sanctions and all of these export bans at him. And so I would imagine that we will see the maximum level of sanctions against top Russian banks, maybe SWIFT, maybe against the Russian central bank. This is a nuclear option in financial sanctions, is the Russian central bank. I would imagine, and I would hope, that all of these would be on the table. All of these not only on the table, would be implemented. Now is the time. President Putin has done what we said we didn't want him to do, and if he did, we were going to sanction him at the top level. At the top level, we should go to the top level of that escalation.
Now, I want to play you a dramatic moment, end of the UN Security Council meeting that just wrapped. It was a Ukrainian ambassador addressing his Russian counterpart. Take a listen.
There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
What's your reaction to that?
He's absolutely right. This is a war crime. The number of civilians and military who will die because of what Mr. Putin has ordered will be enormous. Will be thousands, tens of thousands. Unprovoked attack on a nation, a sovereign nation, on Putin's border, killing thousands of civilians and military. This is a war crime. The ambassador is absolutely right. President Putin will go down with other war criminals, like in the past century, who ordered attacks on innocent people, who ordered attacks on nations on their borders. President Putin will go down with that club, with that group of people, that group of war criminals.
Now that we're here, this crisis has been building for weeks. Do you think the United States and NATO allies did enough in terms of sanctions, in your opinion, beforehand to try and prevent what just happened here tonight?
So the NATO allies and the United States took a lot of steps before this happened, and that was a good thing. They moved a lot of troops. They moved a lot of units from the United States to Eastern Europe. They moved a lot of U.S. forces from Germany, from parts of Europe into the eastern flank of NATO. Those were active steps, active deterrence. That was an attempt to deter President Putin from what he's done today. So that deterrence has now failed. And now we go into exacting the price. We said we were going to do this. We're going to exact a price for doing this on his economy, on him, on his industry. Now's the time to do that.
What could be the next move from NATO allies then if those sanctions did not deter Russia from invading?
So two things. One is to continue to provide and increase dramatically the assistance that now the Ukrainian military needs more than ever. Ukrainian military is on its own. There are no NATO forces there to help them, to fight with them, to fight alongside of them. So they need support. They need equipment. They need ammunition. They need the basis of resistance, and they are going to need then continued support to resist the Russians as they try to occupy. The Russians can get in. The Russians can get into Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. When they try to hold, when they try to do something, if they try to do what the general talked about in terms of replacing this government, they try to occupy a nation of 40 and 44 million people, many of whom, millions of Ukrainians will be fighting the Russians. the occupiers on the streets of their villages and towns and forests. This will be miserable for the Ukrainian, for the occupiers of Ukraine, the Russians, and the United States and other NATO allies from the NATO flank, from the eastern flank, will be supporting this resistance, these civilian resistance, the military resistance, the territorial defense forces. Ukrainians will fight. Their military will fight right now. Their territorial defense forces will then fight once the occupiers try to come into their, and the civilians will fight as well.
It's now dawn in Ukraine, a new dawn. You know so many people there. Have you heard from anyone you know as Ukrainians wake up to what's going to be an incredibly challenging day?
I'm hearing from Ukrainians who've been up all night. They've been up all night. So they've been watching this as we have. And they are just as determined as I just said. These are people who are determined to save their country, to protect their country, to protect their freedom. They've lived under Russian control before. They don't want to go back. They will defend, they will fight. And in the end, Andrew, they will prevail.
It's a new day in Ukraine. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, we appreciate your time. And thank you for joining our special coverage this evening as Russia begins what senior Pentagon officials are calling an invasion of Ukraine. I'm Andrew Dimbert. Good night.
More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. This is what being live is all about. This is ABC News Live.
All right, we're gonna move back. Let's move back.
We're surrounded by people squeezing into this bomb shelter.
We're on an urgent delivery run.
Not afraid to go there.
So my question, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Breaking news, live events.
This is the moment.
Streaming straight to you, anytime, anywhere.
You just met one friend right here.
You're watching ABC News Live. Thanks for streaming with us.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
Seems to change just about every day.
what is it that you really want to know, need to know,
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter,
feel better.
feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Now streaming on ABC News Live. It's all about you.
They were a killing team.
A mother and daughter poisoning our family members.
I mean, this is unheard of. Who does that?
I knew they were drinking antifreeze.
What? Nobody just drinks antifreeze.
It's incredible.
She's never talked publicly until now.
How is it that you could kill your own family?
There's more to that than what people know.
What is the truth, Diane?
The new 2020, Friday at 9/8 Central on ABC. Take America's #1 news with you, anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now.
All right, here we go. You ready? Let's do it.
Yes, it's the show America wants and America needs right now.
This is What Would You Do? Let's go. How are you?
Yes. So what will you be watching Saturdays on ABC News Live?
What would you do? I guess I just found out.
The What Would You Do Marathon, 12 to 6 Eastern, every Saturday on ABC News Live.
My favorite show.
Christopher Steele, the guy who picked a fight with 2 presidents, and he's lived to tell the tale. That now infamous dossier.
Supposedly a tape showing prostitutes hired by Donald Trump urinating on a bed, and would be quite a tape if it in fact existed.
I said, take out the PP tape.
It quickly became a question of how much of this was accurate.
This is the stuff of movies.
A lot of this is the stuff of movies. Story of epic proportions.
Phony stuff.
It's a bunch of crap.
It changed history.
Now with so much on the line, more Americans are turning to